The myth of the natural disaster. Every student of Western history is familiar with the broad, tragic strokes of the Irish potato famine. We know the names and the images, the devastating blight, the withered fields, the gaunt faces of starving peasant families huddled in their cottages. The narrative is one of a natural disaster, a tragic act of God, where a mysterious fungus ruined the humble potato crop and plunged an island into unimaginable suffering. This is the comforting, sanitized version of events, a story where nature is the sole villain and human responsibility is neatly excised. But this textbook tale is an illusion, a carefully constructed veil over a far darker truth. The catastrophe that befell Ireland between 1845 and 1849 was not merely a failure of a single crop. It was the orchestrated failure of a system. The Great Hunger was, in its cruelest essence, a man-made famine. It was a catastrophe engineered not by weather or biology alone, but by the cold, calculated policies of an imperial government that viewed Ireland not as a nation of people in crisis, but as a troublesome colonial asset to be managed, and whose suffering could be leveraged for economic and social restructuring. The potato blight was the spark, but the tinder, the political, economic, and social conditions that allowed hunger to metastasize into mass death, had been stacked high for centuries by British rule.
To accept the simple story of the blight is to miss the profound historical crime at its core, the conscious export of abundant food from a starving land. This crime was perpetrated not in shadowy backrooms, but in the full light of day, justified by economic theory and enforced by the bayonet, creating a chasm between official pronouncements and the reality of carts rolling past starving children laden with grain for export. But to understand how this narrative was constructed, we must first look at the very real biological spark that ignited the colonial powder keg. The arrival of Phyllophthora infestans was an ecological accident, but its transformation into a weapon of mass death was a deliberate political process. The water mold found a perfect host not only in the potato, but in a society engineered for maximum fragility, where the majority existed on a razor's edge of subsistence, denied any stake in the land's broader bounty. The blight exposed this engineered vulnerability, turning a crop failure into a demographic void. This vulnerability was the culmination of long-standing legislative and economic frameworks that treated Irish agriculture as an extractive enterprise, designed to enrich landlords and feed English cities, while offering the cultivator no safety net beyond the thin, starchy reliability of the potato tuber. The mold's rapid, silent destruction of the plant mirrored the silent, bureaucratic destruction of societal resilience that had preceded it.
To comprehend the full horror of what unfolded, one must first erase the mental image of a barren, impoverished Ireland. On the eve of the famine, Ireland was not a land of universal destitution. It was, in fact, a phenomenally productive agricultural economy, a verdant island of plenty within the British Empire. Its lush pastures were famous for cattle, which produced beef, butter, and leather for export. Vast fields yielded abundant harvests of wheat and barley. Oats, a staple grain, grew in profusion. Port cities like Cork, Dublin, and Belfast were hubs of bustling commerce, with warehouses brimming with grain, livestock pens full of animals, and docks lined with ships. The country produced enough grain alone in the 1840s to feed its entire population. This agricultural wealth, however, was a spectacle of cruel irony. It existed parallel to, not for, the majority of the Irish people. The bounty of the land was not destined for local tables, but for the ledger books of absentee Anglo-Irish landlords and the markets of England. Ireland functioned as a vast rural factory for the imperial core, its resources systematically extracted. The peasant majority, crammed onto tiny, subdivided plots of marginal land through a ruthless system of tenant farming, were granted access only to the one crop that could sustain a family on such a small space, the potato.
Thus, the stage was set with a stark, almost surreal contradiction: a land flowing with food, inhabited by a population one failed potato harvest away from catastrophe. This duality was the central fact of Irish life, a daily reminder that the fruits of their labor were never truly theirs, a psychological as well as economic bondage that made the subsequent famine not just a physical ordeal, but a brutal revelation of their dispossession. A farmer tending a field of golden wheat knew his labor would result in grain he could not afford to eat, a cognitive dissonance that poisoned the very idea of work and harvest. If the land was producing food, where was it going? The answer lies in the harsh realities of the empire's ledgers. Every bushel of wheat, every side of bacon had an owner and a price. The intricate web of rents, tariffs, and commercial contracts ensured that the food moved along predetermined paths from Irish field to English market with a mechanical efficiency that no appeal to humanity could disrupt. The system was designed to be waterproof, channeling wealth upward and outward, leaving the producers with only the thin, precarious margin of the potato patch for their own survival. This commercial circuitry was so deeply embedded that to interrupt it was seen not as saving lives, but as committing a form of economic sacrilege, disrupting the natural order of commerce that was believed to govern society's health. The initial response to the potato crop failures in 1845 was not one of urgent, large-scale relief, but of ideological calculation. The true scale of the impending disaster was actively managed, minimized, and reframed from the very beginning by the political and economic orthodoxy in Westminster. The governing philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism, championed by figures like Prime Minister Lord John Russell and his influential Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Charles Wood, held that the government must not interfere with the natural workings of the market, even in the face of mass starvation. Providing free food or halting exports was seen as a morally hazardous act that would corrupt the character of the Irish poor and disrupt the sacred laws of supply and demand. Thus, a narrative was swiftly constructed. This was an act of providence, a regrettable but natural calamity. Reports from Ireland were filtered through this lens. Descriptions of suffering were often attributed to Irish indolence or overpopulation, rather than systemic failure. Official commissions and relief measures were designed to be inadequate, punitive, and slow, often requiring the destitute to perform hard labor for meager rations or to give up their land. The language of bureaucracy became a tool of erasure, masking genocide with terms like surplus population and market correction. This was not a cover-up of secret documents in a locked drawer. It was a cover-up conducted in plain sight, through parliamentary debates, newspaper editorials, and the relentless enforcement of economic policy. The truth England would later try to soften or forget was being written in real time into the very fabric of its response. Every dispatch, every Treasury minute, served to reinforce the idea that the state's role was to oversee a process, not to prevent a tragedy, transforming governance from a duty of care into a passive audit of suffering. The moral weight of decision-making was shifted from human actors to impersonal economic forces, providing a perfect alibi for inaction. The cataclysm that the Irish would name Angorta Mór, the Great Hunger, began not with a bang, but with a sickening, silent rot. The years 1845 to 1849 marked a period of demographic and cultural devastation so profound it seared itself into the nation's soul. At its origin was a microscopic organism, Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that causes late blight. This pathogen arrived in Europe via shipping from the Americas, finding a perfect host in the damp, cool climates of Ireland and the ubiquitous lumper potato. The lumper was a bland, watery variety, but it was a marvel of caloric efficiency, capable of feeding a large family from a single acre of poor land. This reliance was not a matter of choice, but of brutal economic design. The vast majority of Irish Catholics were tenant farmers, living at the mercy of Protestant landlords. Racked by high rents and the practice of subdividing farms among all sons, families were pushed onto ever smaller plots of the least desirable land. On these conacre holdings, only the prolific potato could yield enough calories to survive. Ireland had become a grim monument to monoculture, not by agricultural ignorance, but by colonial fiat. The potato was more than a staple. It was the linchpin in a precarious economic equation, the single variable that allowed the entire exploitative system to function. When that variable failed, the equation collapsed into mass mortality, demonstrating the terrifying fragility of a society built on a single vulnerable point of failure. The arrival of the blight was swift and horrifying. In the autumn of 1845, farmers dug up what appeared to be a healthy harvest, only to find the tubers transforming into a black, foul-smelling sludge within days. Fields that were green and flowering one week were fields of putrid, blackened stems the next, as if scorched by an invisible fire. The stench of decay hung over the countryside. For a population that consumed an estimated 7 million tons of potatoes annually, the loss was catastrophic. The blight returned with even greater fury in 1846, destroying nearly the entire crop. While partial harvests returned in 1847, known as Black 47 for the peak of mortality, and 1848, the damage was irrevocable. The biological spark of Phytophthora infestans had found its tinder in a society engineered for vulnerability. A plant disease became a human disaster because the social and economic structure offered no resilience, no alternative, and, as would soon become terrifyingly clear, no mercy. The repeated strikes of the blight over successive years methodically dismantled any hope of recovery, turning a crisis into a terminal condition for millions. The psychological impact of this repeated destruction was profound, breeding a deep sense of hopelessness as each planting season became an act of faith against a relentless, invisible enemy. The scale of loss during Angorta Moor is not just a statistic, it is a story of a nation being dismantled, person by person, family by family, village by village. To quantify it is to attempt to grasp the ungraspable. In raw demographic collapse, Ireland lost approximately 25% of its total population. From a pre-famine peak of around 8.2 million in 1841, the island was hollowed out. The first and most appalling number is the million dead. They perished not just from straightforward starvation, but from the famine diseases that stalk the malnourished: typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, and scurvy. These diseases ravished bodies weakened by hunger, turning workhouses, roadside ditches, and overcrowded cabins into charnel houses. The social rituals of death and burial broke down entirely. Bodies were often interred hurriedly in mass graves, or simply left where they fell, as communities lost the physical strength and the will to perform customary rites. The very concept of a dignified death, a cornerstone of any culture, was stripped away, adding spiritual devastation to physical annihilation. Alongside the silent landscape of graves emerged the phenomenon of ghost villages. Particularly in the Irish-speaking regions of the West, Connaught and Munster, entire communities were simply wiped from the map. Stone cottages fell into ruin, fields reverted to scrub, and local networks of culture, language, and memory were extinguished. This created a haunting, empty geography that persists in parts of Ireland to this day, a silent testament to the eradication of a way of life. The disappearance of these clusters of humanity represented a loss of intangible heritage, songs, stories, dialects, and knowledge of the local landscape that was as profound as the loss of life itself. It was a cultural extinction event, where not only people died, but entire unique ways of seeing the world, tied to specific hills, streams, and valleys, vanished forever. Confronted with certain death, a second million chose a desperate gamble: emigration. This was not an orderly relocation, but a frantic flight of the starving. They crowded onto infamous coffin ships, overloaded, unsanitary vessels where typhus and malnutrition ran rampant. Mortality rates on these Atlantic crossings could reach 30%. Those who survived arrived in North America and Britain as traumatized refugees, often carrying disease themselves, forming the foundation of the vast Irish diaspora. The most powerful illustration of this population reduction is a modern comparator. Present-day Ireland, even with a thriving economy, has still not regained its pre-1840s population level. The island remains, in a profound sense, a country missing a quarter of its people, a permanent void carved out by hunger and exile. This demographic scar is the famine's most enduring physical monument, a negative space where a nation ought to be, a
constant, silent echo of the loss that shaped its modern identity. Yet, as millions dropped dead or fled from starvation, carts filled with food were continuously rolling down Irish roads towards the ports. This traffic formed a macabre procession, a daily spectacle of abundance amidst deprivation that seared itself into the collective memory of the survivors. It was a visual proof of the system's priorities, a moving tableau that demonstrated food was not scarce, but merely inaccessible to those who needed it most.
This image became a central motif in the folk memory, a symbol of the brutal logic that governed their lives, where commodities had more rites of passage than human beings. This stark coexistence of abundant harvests and widespread starvation was not an accidental paradox. It was the direct outcome of a merciless economic system, functioning perfectly during its cruelest test. While government relief works offered starvation wages for grueling labor, and public works committees debated the cost-effectiveness of saving lives, Ireland's farms and pastures remained prolific. The island, in fact, produced more than enough food to feed its entire population. The critical, lethal fact was its ownership and destination. Under the landlord-tenant system, all crops beyond the tenant's own potato patch were owned by the landlord, often an absentee English proprietor, and were grown for cash, not consumption. The rent was a cash demand, immutable even as the potato turned to slime. To pay it and avoid eviction, families were forced to sell their healthy harvests of wheat, barley, and oats. To put food on their own tables, they would have had to default on their rent, a choice that led to swift homelessness and an even faster death by exposure and hunger on the roadside. This created an inescapable trap. Selling food to avoid eviction meant starving slowly. Keeping food to avoid starvation meant facing immediate, violent displacement. Thus, throughout the worst years of the famine, Ireland remained a net exporter of food. Between 1845 and 1850, vast quantities of grain, butter, beef, pork, and poultry were systematically shipped from its starving shores. The ports of Waterford, Cork, and Limerick were scenes of grotesque juxtaposition, skeletal figures begging for scraps on the docks, while gangs of laborers, under the watch of British troops, loaded holds with tens of thousands of tons of wheat, beans, and peas bound for the markets of Liverpool and London. The system was so brazen that official export data has become one of the most damning indictments. Conservative estimates suggest that in the single cataclysmic year of Black 47, Ireland exported approximately 430,000 tons of grain, enough to have fed double the number of people who starved that year. The economist John Mitchell would later pen his searing indictment. The Almighty, indeed, sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. The convoys transporting this bounty were not discreet commercial operations. They were military expeditions. British soldiers and constabulary, armed with muskets and fixed bayonets, escorted the grain carts and guarded the ports. Their mission was explicit: to protect the property of the landlords from the depredations of the starving multitude. In numerous documented instances, troops opened fire on crowds who attempted to stop the export of food from their own localities. This was laissez-faire capitalism at its most brutal, ideological extreme. The free market and the sanctity of property were defended by state violence, while the invisible hand doled out death by starvation to those who could not afford the price of the food growing beside their homes. The market's freedom was absolute, but it was a freedom enjoyed only by capital and commodities, not by human beings. The bayonet, in this context, was the ultimate enforcement mechanism of economic theory. This forced extraction of wealth wasn't just an economic practice. It was codified and enforced through deeply cruel bureaucratic laws, which weaponized relief itself to engineer social change. The most infamous of these was the Quarter-Acre Clause, also known as the Gregory Clause, inserted into the 1847 Poor Law Extension Act. Its stipulation was inhuman in its simplicity. No tenant holding more than a quarter-acre of land could receive any form of public relief, either inside or outside the dreaded workhouse. For a subsistence farmer, this presented an impossible, state-mandated choice. Hold on to your tiny parcel of land,
your family's home, its history, its sole means of future survival, and watch your children starve before your eyes, or surrender it all to become a destitute pauper, eligible for a place in the horrific, disease-ridden workhouse system.
Many chose a third, heartbreaking path to physically dismantle their own homes, tumbling the thatched roofs of their cabins with their own hands, to prove to the inspecting relief officer that they were now utterly landless and homeless, and thus qualified for aid. This practice gave rise to the term tumbling the roofs. More commonly, it was done by force. Landlords, seeing the famine as an opportunity to clear their estates of unprofitable smallholders and consolidate land for more lucrative cattle grazing, hired bands of tumblers or crowbar brigades. These men, often accompanied by police, would evict entire families, the sick, the elderly, infants, and immediately demolish their cottages, rendering them uninhabitable. Over 250,000 formal evictions were recorded between 1849 and 1854, a figure that doesn't account for the countless voluntary surrenders made under the duress of the quarter-acre law. This policy transformed the landscape, creating vast plains of rubble where villages once stood, and turned the roads into streams of homeless, broken people, a process chillingly described by officials as clearing the land. The clause was a masterstroke of social engineering, using the leverage of hunger to dismantle the traditional Irish rural society in one brutal legislative act. It was policy as a scalpel, excising an entire class of people from the land they had known for generations.
While these laws systematically stripped the Irish of their land and dignity, London was busy spinning a different story for the rest of the world, operating a sophisticated political public relations machine to minimize culpability. The official line, propagated by government officials and echoed in supportive newspapers like The Times, was a potent mix of economic dogma, racial prejudice, and religious fatalism. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official who effectively controlled the purse strings for famine relief, was a true believer in the Malthusian theory that the famine was a necessary, if tragic, corrective to overpopulation. In his view, divine providence was using natural disaster to solve a social problem. Trevelyan famously wrote that the famine was a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, which revealed the deep and inveterate root of social evil. This ideological shield justified inaction. When reports of mass death flooded in, they were dismissed as Irish exaggeration or clerical hysteria. The government actively downplayed the scale of the catastrophe, rejecting substantial aid from foreign governments, including a symbolic but meaningful offer of assistance from the United States Congress, on the grounds that Britain was fully capable of handling its own internal affairs. They also curtailed private charity by setting a political ceiling. The narrative they crafted for domestic consumption portrayed the Irish peasant as lazy, improvident, and genetically prone to dependency. The famine was framed not as a failure of imperial policy, but as a moral failing of the Irish character, a necessary lesson that would, in the cold calculus of the day, teach them industry and spur modern agricultural reform. Censorship and control of information were key. The harrowing illustrations published in the Illustrated London News, which shocked the British public, were an exception that slipped through a tightly managed information environment designed to protect the government from political embarrassment and financial liability. The goal was to shape perception, to turn a crime of policy into an unfortunate natural event, thereby insulating the state from moral and financial responsibility. This narrative management was a precursor to modern propaganda, where controlling the story is as important as controlling the event itself. Despite this fierce campaign of denial, the true severity of the situation reached the highest offices of the British Empire, eliciting a response from the Crown that laid bare the chasm between imperial wealth and political will. Queen Victoria, reigning over the globe's wealthiest empire, was personally petitioned for aid by Irish nobles and was aware of the unfolding horror. Her personal response was a donation of £2,000 to the British Relief Association in 1847.
While a significant sum, it was a minuscule fraction of both her personal fortune and the resources of the state she embodied. a sum she would spend on a single elaborate gown. More damning than the amount was the unspoken protocol it triggered. In the rigid hierarchy of Victorian society, it was considered inappropriate for any subject to donate more than the monarch. Thus, Victoria's £2,000 effectively set a philanthropic cap for the British aristocracy, stifling what could have been a far greater mobilization of private wealth. She made no forceful public appeal for mercy, nor did she apply direct political pressure on her Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, to abandon the lethal doctrines of non-interference. Her only visit to Ireland during the famine years came in 1849, after the worst of the mortality had passed, and was largely a ceremonial tour. This profound disconnect between the symbolic power of the crown and its negligible material intervention cemented a bitter legacy. In Irish folk memory and nationalist discourse, she became enduringly known as An Bonrian Gorta, the Famine Queen, a monarch who reigned in ornate palaces while a quarter of her subjects perished or fled under her watch. Her token gesture, contrasted with the empire's capacity, became a lasting symbol of a ruling class that valued political economy and social order over the lives of its most vulnerable people. It was a lesson in the limits of ceremonial sympathy when divorced from decisive action, a lesson in how symbolic power, when not exercised substantively, can become a symbol of abandonment. Where the mighty British crown offered a mere token, a ruler from a completely different continent and religion stepped forward in an act of genuine humanitarianism that London saw only as a threat. Sultan Abdulmejid I of the Ottoman Empire, upon learning of the scale of the disaster through his diplomats, pledged £10,000 sterling in aid, equivalent to over $1.3 million today. Furthermore, he secretly dispatched 3 ships loaded with wheat, barley, and other foodstuffs from the ports of the eastern Mediterranean to Ireland. When British diplomats in Constantinople got wind of the plan, they were horrified. The political optics were unacceptable. A Muslim sultan outdoing the Christian queen of the world's premier empire in charity to her own subjects. The British government formally requested that the sultan reduce his financial donation to a lesser sum, so it would not exceed Victoria's. Abdulmejid I complied on paper, officially recording a donation of £1,000, but historians widely believe the full £10,000 was still sent through back channels. The greater challenge was the food ships. The Royal Navy, to prevent a public relations disaster, effectively blockaded the standard ports. The Ottoman captains, undeterred, were forced to bypass the major harbors of Dublin and Cork. Sailing up the Irish Sea, they found a safe haven in the smaller port of Drogheda, north of Dublin, where they successfully offloaded their precious cargo in 1847. The gratitude for this covert act of mercy was profound and lasting. The people of Drogheda never forgot, and to this day, the town's coat of arms and the crest of its football club, Drogheda United, feature the Ottoman star and crescent as a permanent tribute to the Sultan's blocked armada of compassion, a poignant symbol of the aid that arrived despite, not because of, the imperial authorities in London. This episode underscores how humanitarian impulses were viewed through a lens of geopolitical rivalry and prestige, where saving face was deemed more important than saving lives. It revealed that the state's priority was not alleviating suffering, but maintaining a hierarchy of power and perception, even at the cost of its own citizens. While the official narrative in London continued to tout the virtues of free trade and self-sufficiency, a different story was being whispered across the cables and sails of the 1840s world. The sheer volume of emigration and the desperate letters home from coffin ships carried the truth to every port. British newspapers might downplay the distress, but American, French, and even Ottoman editors published reports from their own correspondents and clergy in Ireland, painting a far grimmer picture. This international spread of information sparked one of the world's first and most poignant modern humanitarian movements, built on a global diaspora and a profound sense of shared suffering. The famine became a global media event, albeit one where the official version competed with more credible grassroots accounts from victims and eyewitnesses. This created a dissonance between the state-sanctioned story and the visceral testimonies circulating among ordinary people across the world. This global response was defined not by the actions of states,
but by the sacrificial charity of the poor for the poor. The most iconic example came not from a European capital, but from the recently resettled lands of the Choctaw Nation. In March 1847, just 16 years after the tribe endured the forced relocation and mass death of the Trail of Tears, members gathered at a council in Scullyville, Indian Territory. Moved by news reports of a starving people being displaced from their homeland, a pain they understood in their bones, they collected $170, equivalent to over $5,000 today, and sent it to a New York-based Irish relief fund. Their act was not one of surplus wealth, but of profound empathy drawn from a well of recent trauma. The donation was a quiet, stunning rebuke to the colonial calculus of London, demonstrating a form of humanity that transcended borders, religion, and race.
It highlighted a moral clarity absent in the corridors of power, where shared experience of dispossession forged a bond more powerful than imperial allegiance. This act of solidarity between two colonized peoples stood in stark moral contrast to the policies of the colonizing power. Across the Atlantic, other marginalized communities followed suit. Formerly enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, Quaker communities in the United States, and Jewish congregations in Europe organized grassroots collections, bypassing official British channels entirely. They sent funds directly to the Society of Friends, Quakers, and other relief committees operating on the ground in Ireland, knowing these groups prioritized feeding the hungry over enforcing economic doctrine. This international solidarity network highlighted a fundamental truth. While the British government saw the crisis through a lens of political economy and control, the world saw it as a simple, urgent matter of life and death. The aid, whether from Constantinople or Choctaw territory, flowed specifically because it circumvented the state machinery that had failed the Irish people, proving that compassion could and did find a way where policy refused to budge. These acts created an alternative channel of survival, a slender thread of hope spun from global empathy that ran counter to the official currents of indifference. They showed that human connection could breach the walls of official indifference, creating a parallel system of care based on conscience rather than ideology. It was only after the worst of the dying was over and the population irrevocably broken that the government finally adjusted its ledgers. In 1850, with the famine's demographic cataclysm complete, Westminster passed legislation to reduce the crushing burden of poor law taxes in Ireland and cancel the so-called famine debts that had accumulated on the books of bankrupt unions. This act of bureaucratic absolution was a classic case of too little, too late. The debts themselves were a grotesque irony. Money borrowed not for food or seed, but by starving local boards to fund the construction and maintenance of workhouses and to pay the rates demanded by London. The system had forced the destitute to take on debt to fund their own imprisonment in institutions of last resort, where mortality rates were often as high as the blighted fields outside. This was the ultimate perversion of relief, creating financial obligations for the dying to pay for the machinery of their own dismal containment. The 1850 concession was a hollow victory, a financial footnote to a genocide. By then, over 1 million were dead. Another 1.5 million had fled, and the social fabric of rural Ireland lay in tatters. The survivors who remained were not farmers ready for a fresh start, but a traumatized population living in utter destitution on a radically transformed landscape. Landlords, having used the famine to clear estates through death and eviction, had consolidated holdings into larger, more profitable pastoral farms. The class of smallholders and laborers who had defined pre-famine Ireland was decimated. The debt cancellation did nothing to restore lost lives, rebuild tumbled cottages, or return the exiled. It merely tidied up the accounting after the estate had been liquidated. It was the final, cynical act of a state that had managed the crisis as a balance sheet, acknowledging its fiscal errors only after the human cost had been fully extracted and the ledger of suffering closed to further entries. This belated ledger adjustment was an admission of administrative failure, but not of moral guilt. It cleaned up the numbers without ever confronting the human reality behind them.
It was an attempt to close the book on a disaster by squaring the financial accounts, while leaving the moral account forever in the red. These final ledger adjustments closed the official books on the famine, but the psychological and historical reckoning was just beginning. The trauma was now embedded in the national psyche, a raw wound that would fuel political nationalism and a deep-seated mistrust of British government for generations.
The famine ceased to be a current event and became history, but it was a history fiercely contested between the sanitized record of the state and the visceral memory of the people. This contestation itself became a legacy, shaping Irish politics, literature, and identity for more than a century, ensuring that the hunger was not just a memory of the past, but a lens through which the present and future were viewed. A ledger of lives. The Great Irish Famine, known in Ireland as An Gorta Mór, created a ledger written in two incompatible currencies. On one side, a tally of human catastrophe, an estimated 1 million lives extinguished by starvation and disease. A further 1.5 million souls, 1 in 4 of the population, dispersed across the globe in a desperate flight for survival. On the other side, the neat columns of an imperial account. Exports of grain and livestock from Ireland to Britain during the worst hunger years valued at an estimated £17 million. A net profit recorded for the Treasury from Irish taxes and duties throughout the period. A relief policy meticulously designed to avoid interference with market principles, regardless of the corpses piling up at market gates. This was not a natural disaster met with an overwhelmed response. It was a social and biological crisis managed with the cold, bureaucratic precision of a state that valued property, profit, and political ideology more than the lives of a subject people.
The truth England tried to erase was this stark arithmetic. The empire remained financially solvent and well-fed precisely because Ireland was allowed to starve. The ledger of lives was deemed an acceptable column to debit in order to credit the ledger of finance, a chilling demonstration of how human beings can be reduced to statistical inputs in a grand, cruel economic experiment. The famine revealed that in the calculus of empire, populations could be assets or liabilities, and that liabilities could be written off through demographic catastrophe, framed as inevitable tragedy. The diaspora's memory. Yet ledgers can be contested, and official narratives can be overwritten by the indelible ink of lived experience. The million who emigrated did not leave their memories behind in the hold of the coffin ships. They carried with them the visceral truth of food sailing out of Cork as children died in ditches, of the sound of roofs being tumbled by bailiffs, of the hollow-eyed resignation of the workhouse. In the tenements of Boston, the canals of Canada, and the mining towns of Australia, they told these stories. They wrote letters, sang laments, and built communities where An Gorta Mór was not a historical footnote, but the foundational trauma. This diaspora became a global archive of resistance against amnesia.
In doing so, they ensured that John Mitchell's scorching indictment, the Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine, would echo through generations, long after British schoolbooks had moved on. The survival of this memory is the ultimate defeat of the Victorian propaganda machine. The truth was preserved not in state records, but in the broken hearts and steadfast tongues of the scattered Irish nation. This oral and cultural archive served as a corrective, a persistent counter-narrative that would eventually force the official story to be re-examined. The diaspora became the guardians of an alternative history, one written in the language of personal loss and communal survival, ensuring the moral and political dimensions of the famine were never fully buried. Guarding the truth. Uncovering this erased history matters profoundly because it is a masterclass in the mechanics of power. It shows how catastrophe can be framed as inevitability, how culpability can be dissolved into administrative failure, and how the voices of the starving can be drowned out by the rhetoric of progress and political economy. The Irish famine teaches us that the most dangerous lies are not wild fabrications, but the selective truths, the omitted contexts, and the morally anesthetizing language of bureaucracy. Guarding against this requires a vigilant historical literacy, a willingness to ask not just what happened, but who benefited, whose story was silenced, and what alternative choices were available. In an age of information overload and renewed nationalism, the lesson of Engortimor is timeless. The line between tragedy and atrocity is drawn by human choice and political will. To remember the famine truthfully is to honor the dead, to understand the present diaspora, and to arm ourselves with the critical tools needed to identify when history, in any era, is being quietly, efficiently erased before our eyes. It is a warning that the language of crisis management, of economic necessity, and of natural disaster can often be the architecture of human-made horror, and that vigilance is the price of preventing its repetition. This vigilance involves scrutinizing the official story, listening for the silences within it, and remembering that behind every statistic of a natural disaster, there lies a complex web of human decisions that either mitigate or magnify the suffering.